The Duke gave her a house that was already killing someone. He didn't tell her that part. He told her it was generosity, a widow's provision, signed and sealed, delivered with a smile that never once reached his eyes. What he didn't say was that the last woman who lived in that house had vanished from it 11 years ago, and no one in the county would say her name out loud, not even to strangers, not even after several glasses of wine had loosened every other secret at the table. Clara Wren didn't know any of that yet. She only knew she had 1 year to make Hollowmere pay for itself in coin a magistrate could count and a physician could sign off on, or she would lose everything. Not the house, not the money. Everything. Her daughter included. The solicitor's office smelled of cold tallow and older paper. The particular smell of a room where difficult news is delivered often enough that no one has bothered airing it out between occasions. Clara Wren sat with her daughter's small hand gripped tight in her own, and she did not let go of it once during the entire reading of the will, not when the figures were named, not when the terms were explained, not even when the solicitor's voice dropped briefly into something that might almost have been pity. Hollowmere, together with its house, its tenant lands, and its considerable accumulated debts, is settled upon Mrs. Clara Wren, widow, for her lifetime use, provided she demonstrates within 12 months that the estate has been soundly and competently managed. The solicitor did not look up from the page when he read the word competently. He had, Clara suspected, read that particular clause aloud before to other women in other rooms very much like this one, and had learned that meeting anyone's eyes at that exact moment tended to make the whole business considerably harder for everyone involved. Duke Julian Wren, 4th Duke of Callowmere, sat across the room with his hands folded, watching her the way a man watches weather he has already predicted and finds mildly tedious to sit through regardless. "You understand the terms," he said. It was not a question. Julian Wren rarely asked questions. He stated things in a level, unhurried voice, and waited for the world to arrange itself accordingly, which it generally did because 31 years of being obeyed teaches a man that obedience is simply the natural order of things rather than something earned or granted. "I understand there is a house," Clara said. "There is considerably more than a house," Julian said, and something in the flat hazel of his eyes suggested he found this correction faintly satisfying to deliver. "There is a clause. If, at the year's end, the estate is found by 2 physicians and a magistrate to have been mismanaged beyond the ordinary judgment of a rational woman, guardianship of both the property and the child reverts to me as the nearest male relation of standing." The room went very quiet. Somewhere down the corridor, a clerk's pen scratched steadily against paper, indifferent to the sentence that had just been passed in this particular room. Alice, 5 years old, looked up at her mother and did not understand the words rational woman or mismanaged or guardian, but she understood, the way small children always understand more than adults credit them with, that her mother's hand had gone very cold around her own, and something important and frightening had just been decided by men in a room she was not asked to speak in. "You are testing whether I will fail," Clara said. "I am testing whether you are sane enough to try," Julian said. "It is a kindness, really, though I do not expect you to see it that way today. Most women in your position are not given the chance to prove anything at all. They are simply told the answer has already been decided and asked to accept it gracefully. I am offering you a year. I would think that generous under the circumstances." Clara did not weep. She had decided, somewhere in the space between the solicitor reading out the figure of Hollowmere's outstanding debts, £1,100 and some odd shillings, a sum that made the clerk's pen pause mid-scratch, and the moment Julian rose from his chair, that she would not give this man the particular satisfaction of watching her come apart in front of him. Whatever else this year cost her, it would not cost her that. He rose, buttoned his coat with the unhurried precision of a man for whom every gesture is already a small deliberate performance of control, and left her holding a deed to a house no one in that office had been willing to describe to her in any detail at all. The carriage he had arranged to take her there arrived the following morning, 3 days ahead of the date she had privately expected, which she understood later to have been entirely deliberate. A woman given less time to prepare makes more visible mistakes in the early weeks, and mistakes made in the early weeks are the ones a magistrate remembers most clearly come the reckoning. Hollowmere sat 7 miles into fen country, past the last decent road, at the end of a causeway that flooded twice a year, whether anyone had asked it to or not, and apparently been doing so for longer than anyone currently employed on the estate could remember with any confidence. The carter who drove her out wouldn't take her payment until they cleared the gates and turned the horses back toward the main road. "Don't like leaving folk out here after dark," he said, when Clara asked why he seemed in so hurry to be gone. He wouldn't say more than that, no matter how she pressed him, and in the end she stopped pressing, because she understood, even in those first 10 minutes, that this was going to be a house full of things people declined to say twice. The house itself was worse than the solicitor's papers had prepared her. Black damp climbed the stone in long, dark fingers. Half the east wing had sunk at one corner, settling slowly and patiently into the fen. The way a ship settles into water, it has finally stopped fighting. The roof over the old nursery wing had lost its slates in 3 separate places, and rain had been finding its way through those gaps for long enough that the ceiling below had begun to sag in a slow curve, like something exhausted. But it was the garden that stopped her breath entirely. Someone had planted it with real love once. Roses gone wild now, strangling themselves against a rusted arbor that had not been oiled in a decade. A stone bench, moss-blind, facing directly toward a single window on the east wing's 2nd floor, a window that had been boarded over, she noticed, from the inside rather than the outside, which struck her as a strange enough detail that she stood staring at it for a long moment before Mrs. Dabney, the thin, watchful housekeeper who had stayed on unpaid because, in her own words, somebody had to, came out to greet her. "Someone lived here before me?" Clara asked. Mrs. Dabney's hands went very still on her apron, a habit Clara would come to recognize over the following weeks as the woman's particular tell whenever a question crossed into territory she had been instructed long ago never to discuss. "Her Brace," Mrs. Dabney said carefully, "the last Duchess." "Where is she now?" "Gone away for her health," they said, 11 years back." "Gone where?" "Nobody's ever asked, ma'am," Mrs. Dabney said, and there was something in the flatness of her voice, the careful, rehearsed quality of it, that told Clara this exact exchange had likely happened before with other people in other years and had always ended the same way. Nobody's ever asked twice. Clara filed the detail away, the way she had learned across a difficult marriage and a harder widowhood to file away every piece of information that did not immediately make sense, on the theory that sense would eventually arrive if she simply kept enough of the pieces in reach when it did. That first night she found the dog. He was enormous, grey-muzzled, half-feral, and had made himself a den under the collapsed corner of the east wing, the one place in the entire ruined property he seemed to guard rather than avoid. He would not come near her, he would not leave either, no matter how far she withdrew, and something in his flat, patient watchfulness reminded her, uncomfortably, of a soldier standing post over a grave he has been forbidden to explain. "What's he called?" Clara asked. "Nobody's called him anything in years," Mrs. Dabney said. "Her Grace used to call him Solomon." Clara looked at the dog a long moment. He looked back with the tired patience of a creature that has been waiting a very long time and has, somewhere along the way, stopped expecting the wait to end. "Solomon," she said quietly, testing the name in the cold air. His ears moved, just slightly. It was the only answer she got that night, and it was, she found, considerably more than she had expected to get from anything in that house. 12 months. That was the whole of what she had, and she spent the first of them the way she had spent every hard year of her life, sleeves rolled to the elbow, her fear folded small enough to carry without letting it show on her face where the tenants or the household or a passing physician's assistant sent quietly to observe her might see it and mistake it for the wrong kind of weakness. The debts alone told a story worth reading carefully. £1,142, 6 shillings, according to the estate's own account books, a sum accumulated, Clara noted, with growing suspicion as she worked through the entries by candlelight, not steadily across 11 years, the way ordinary neglect accumulates debt, but in 3 specific, disproportionate surges, each one following close on the heels of a season when the tenant rents should, by any reasonable measure, have shown a healthy surplus instead. She sold what jewelry remained from her marriage for the roofer, a hard bargain struck with a man in the nearest market town, who tried twice to quote her a price meant for a woman with no head for figures, and was corrected twice with the flat, patient precision of a woman who had kept her own household accounts since she was 17 years old, and had no intention of paying 2 shillings more than any fact warranted. She learned the drainage of the lower fields from a tenant named Josiah Prendergast, a man who had farmed Hollowmere land for 30 years and had never, in all that time, been asked his opinion by anyone standing above him in the household's hierarchy. "Did the drainage fail that year?" Clara asked. Prendergast was quiet a moment, working his jaw the way careful men do when deciding how much truth a question actually wants. "The drainage didn't fail, ma'am," he said finally. "Attention did." She kept ledgers in her own hand from that point forward, every shilling in and every shilling out, because she understood, better than the Duke likely credited her with understanding, that numbers were the one language a magistrate would be compelled to believe, regardless of whatever else was said about her in the drawing rooms of the county. She recorded the roofer's fee, £4.10. She recorded Prendergast's wages, fairly renegotiated upward once she understood how badly he had been underpaid for the better part of a decade. She recorded the sale of 2 barren ewes that had been eating feed without producing lambs for 3 seasons running, a small correction that nonetheless returned 11 shillings to an account that had until then only ever moved in one direction. She did not weep in front of the tenants. She did not weep in front of Mrs. Dabney, not even the afternoon the housekeeper found her standing motionless in the ruined east wing, with her hand pressed flat against the boarded window, and said nothing at all, only laid a worn blanket over her shoulders and withdrew without a word, the way one might withdraw from a room where a private grief was in progress that no comfort could properly interrupt. She did not weep in front of her daughter, not once, not even the night in February when the nursery roof finally gave way entirely under a storm that had been building all week, and she carried Alice through freezing rain to the single dry room left standing, and sat up until dawn with the child's head heavy in her lap, listening to water find its patient way through stone that should, by any reasonable engineering, have held against it. She did weep once, alone in the ruined east wing, her hand pressed flat against that same boarded window, the rose garden gone entirely to shadow in the dying light. She never told anyone that. Solomon lay pressed warm against her side the entire time and did not move until she stopped, and something in his stillness, patient and unjudging, made the weeping considerably easier to bear than it might otherwise have been. It was in that same wing some weeks later, prying loose a rotted floorboard to check the joists beneath for further rot, that she found the tin box. Inside were letters, a woman's hand, careful and small, the ink faded to a rust brown that suggested considerable age, and beneath the letters, folded separately, a physician's certificate, signed, dated, sealed with proper legal formality, declaring Rosalind Wren, Duchess of Calomere, of unsound mind and unfit for the management of her own affairs, on the word of 2 doctors who had, according to the dates recorded in the letters beneath it, examined her for a total of 4 minutes before arriving at that conclusion. Clara sat on the cold floor with the box in her lap for a long time, and for the first time since the solicitor's office she allowed herself to consider, fully and without flinching, the possibility that the year she had been given was never meant to be survived at all. I need you to sit with me here for just a moment, because what comes next is the part that changes everything, and I want to make sure you're actually ready for it before we go on. The second letter wasn't addressed to anyone. It read the way a person writes when they are speaking to a version of themselves they are afraid of losing before the ink has even dried. "They will not let me see my son," it read. "They tell me I imagined the missing accounts, that I imagined the money moving to London under names that are not mine and not his. Julian says I have grown strange since the birth, that grief for the child I lost before has curdled into fancy. I do not feel strange. I feel like the only sane person left in this house, and that, I am beginning to understand, is precisely the kind of thing a mad woman would also believe, which is the cruelest trick I have yet encountered in a life that has not been short of them. If anyone ever reads this, I am not mad. I found what he was doing to the estate accounts, quietly, over 3 seasons, moving tenant rents through a merchant's name in London that does not exist under any registration I have been able to trace, and within the month of my asking too many questions about it, 2 doctors I had never once met before that morning declared me unfit for the management of my own affairs. I am to be removed to a private house near Colney Hatch. I do not know if I will be permitted to write again, or to whom, or whether anyone will ever read this at all. Whoever comes after me, ask the dog. He knows where I walked. He knows I was not the one who was lost. Clara sat very still. Rosalind Wren had not died. She had been removed 11 years ago under a signature that took 4 minutes to earn, and a law that asked no one's permission but a husband's, the Lunacy Act carrying, in its practical application, considerably more weight in a woman's fate than any court of ordinary law would ever be permitted to wield without at least the appearance of a fair hearing. Clara's hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against the cold floorboards and made them stop, the way she had learned across a hard year to make everything about herself go still, when stillness was the only thing standing between her and whatever came next. Then she went and found Solomon, and she said very quietly, "Show me." He led her to the fen's edge, to a stretch of causeway that flooded before anywhere else did, and there he stopped and sat and would not go a single step further, the way an animal will not cross ground it has learned once at terrible cost to fear. There, half sunk in reed and black water, was the wreck of a small rowing boat. 11 years of weather had not been kind to it, but wedged beneath the rotted bench seat, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff as old leather, was a second box. Rosalind's own copies of the estate accounts, the real ones, the ones that showed in her own careful hand exactly where 3 years of tenant rents had gone before anyone thought to call her mad for asking the question aloud. £412 diverted the first year, 560 the second, considerably more the third, the year Clara understood now that Rosalind had finally pressed the question too far and been removed for her trouble. Clara carried both boxes back to the house in the deepening dark, Solomon walking so close against her leg that she nearly stumbled twice over him, and she did not sleep that night. She wrote instead, by candlelight, to a lawyer in London named Gideon Ashcombe, a man Prendergast swore was the only solicitor in 3 counties who would take a tenant's sworn word over a duke's without so much as blinking. He came within the week, a slight, unremarkable man in a plain dark coat with ink permanently staining the first 2 fingers of his right hand, the kind of man easily underestimated by anyone accustomed to judging worth by the cut of a coat. He read both letters twice. He read the accounts 3 times, his silence stretching longer with each pass. A stillness Clara would come to understand over the following weeks was his particular tell that the evidence in front of him was considerably worse than he had allowed himself to expect. When he finally looked up at her across the kitchen table, his face carried the flat, careful expression of a man doing arithmetic he did not like the answer to. "If she's alive," he said, "she's the single witness in all of England who can testify from the inside to exactly how this scheme functions, and if she's alive, someone has spent 11 years working very hard to ensure that fact stays quiet. Then he has to make certain no one ever finds her," Clara said, "and my year is nearly up." Colney Hatch was not a name whispered gently in any drawing-room she had ever sat in. Private wings, family wings, the kind of arrangement reserved for women whose relations paid handsomely to guarantee that no questions were asked and no visitors permitted beyond the ones the paying relation had personally approved. Gideon could not get her through the front gate under any name that would survive scrutiny. So Clara went in through the laundry in a borrowed apron with a basket of mending balanced on one hip and a false name ready on her tongue, and she understood, walking those long grey corridors, exactly what she was gambling. If anyone recognized her, if anyone asked one question too many, if word of a stranger asking after the Fourth Ward reached the Duke before she reached whatever remained of his wife, she would not walk back out of a place like this either if that happened, and she knew it with the same flat certainty she had once used to calculate a roofer's honest price. She found her in the Fourth Ward, grey-haired now, though she could not have been much past 40, sitting very straight in a hard chair by a window that did not open, the way a woman sits when she has spent 11 years refusing to let a room decide her posture for her. "Your Grace," Clara said softly. The woman's head came up. Her eyes were clear, entirely, devastatingly clear, nothing in them of the fancy or the strangeness the certificate in the tin box had sworn to under 2 physicians' signatures. "No one's called me that in a long time," Rosalind said. "I found your letters, I found the accounts, I found Solomon." Something in Rosalind Wren's face broke open, quietly, like ice giving way at last beneath weight it has held far too long to remember what it felt like without it. "He's still there," she whispered. "He waited." "He's still there," Clara said, "and I need you to come with me, because your husband is about to do to me precisely what he did to you 11 years ago, and I am done letting him decide how this particular story ends." The hearing was set for the last week of Clara's year, in the same cold room where it had all begun, before the same magistrate the Duke had already, according to Gideon's own careful investigation, spoken with twice in private beforehand. Julian Wren arrived composed, unhurried, a man come to collect a debt he considered already settled in his own favor, his hands folded in exactly the posture Clara had learned across a hard year to associate with the 3 seconds of silence that always preceded something cruel. He had not expected the doors to open behind him and for his own wife to walk through them. The room did not gasp. It went perfectly, completely silent. The particular silence of a great many people realizing, all at once and together, that the story they had been told for 11 years running was a lie constructed for someone else's convenience. Gideon laid out the accounts first, £412, then 560, then the larger third-year figure that had, by his careful tracing, finally been recovered in full from a merchant's account in London, registered under a name that existed nowhere in any legitimate ledger of trade. Clara laid out the letters after him, reading only the passages the magistrate specifically required, her voice level and unhurried, refusing to let it shake even once across sentences that had cost her considerable private grief to read alone by candlelight. The magistrate read the physician's certificate last, turning it over once in his hands. 4 minutes of examination, 2 signatures, 1 husband's word weighed against nothing at all in the way of independent evidence. He set it down on the table at last like something that had gone cold and unpleasant in his grip. Julian Wren did not shout. He did not deny it, not with any conviction that reached his voice in any way the room found convincing. He simply stood there, in front of his wife, his sister-in-law by circumstance, and a room full of men who had, until that exact morning, nodded along agreeably with every word he had ever offered them, and for the first time in 11 years he had absolutely nothing left to say at all. The estate remains with Mrs. Wren, the magistrate said. The guardianship clause is void, in full, effective immediately. And, Your Grace, he did not look up from his papers as he added this last part, the commissioners in lunacy will want a rather full accounting of their own before this particular matter is considered finished. Julian Wren asked to see her once more before the commissioners took their full accounting, and Clara nearly refused. Then she went because she had spent a year learning that refusing to look directly at a thing did not, in her considerable experience, make that thing any smaller. He was seated in the same study where he had once handed her a deed, like a sentence passed down from a bench he alone occupied. He looked older than he had a year ago. Not humbled, Julian Wren did not, she suspected, know how to be humbled in any way that would survive contact with a mirror, but smaller, the particular way a man looks once the room finally stops arranging itself to suit him. You could have simply failed, he said. Most women would have. I know, Clara said. Why didn't you? She thought of the boarded window, the dog who had kept an 11-year watch over a wall no one else had thought to guard. The letter that ended, "Ask the dog, he knows I was not the one who was lost." Because somebody already had, she said, and nobody went looking for her. I was not going to be the second woman this house let quietly disappear. She did not wait for his answer. She did not require one. The rest of that year, and the year that followed it, Hollowmere stopped being a house that swallowed women whole, and became instead a house that grew things. The roses came back first, Rosalind's roses, freed at last from 11 years of choking bramble, blooming that spring with a stubbornness that made the whole county talk over their tea in a manner considerably kinder than the talk that had once surrounded the estate's name. Rosalind stayed on, not as a guest requiring careful management, but as family, teaching Alice to name every flower the way her own father had once taught her, before the world had found a way to take that particular inheritance from her for 11 long years. Solomon slept by the kitchen fire every night now, an old dog finally permitted to stop guarding a grave that had turned out against every reasonable expectation the Fen country had ever offered him, not to be a grave at all. The tenants who had been quietly bled for 11 years received their rents corrected, in full, with fair terms renegotiated across every holding on the estate. Prendergast's own arrangement now standing as the model Clara applied evenly to every family under her care. The ledgers, once a record of steady loss disguised as ordinary misfortune, now showed a surplus for the first time in over a decade, £118 recovered in the final quarter alone, a figure Clara recorded in her own careful hand with no more visible satisfaction than she had ever permitted herself across the entire difficult year, though something in the particular firmness of her final stroke beneath the total suggested the number meant considerably more to her than the ink alone could carry. And in the second autumn after the hearing, a plain black carriage came up the causeway that no grand carriage had ever previously bothered to travel, and out stepped two ladies from the royal household, who had heard through a magistrate's report that had by then travelled considerably further than the Duke had ever intended it to, about a ruined estate a widow had rebuilt with her own two hands, and a duchess a husband had tried to erase from every record that mattered, and a dog who had kept an 11-year watch over the truth until someone finally came looking hard enough to find it. The Queen herself came the following spring to walk the restored rose garden and take tea with the woman the whole country was now calling, with no trace of the old mockery left anywhere in the phrase, the Duchess who wasn't lost. Clara stood at the gate and watched the royal party come up the causeway, Alice's small hand in her own, Solomon leaning warm and steady against her leg, Rosalind standing quiet and upright at her shoulder in deep moss green, the first colour she had worn in 11 years. She did not weep. She had earned, at last, the right to simply stand there and watch it happen. The Duke gave her a ruined house because he believed a ruin was the safest place in the world to bury a woman. He was wrong twice over, because it turns out you can bury two women in the very same ground, and both of them can still, given enough patience and one good dog, find their way back out. If this one hit different, if the stakes finally felt like they mattered all the way through, hit subscribe, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, and tell us honestly, did you see Rosalind coming, or did that reveal catch you exactly where it was built to? The next story is already waiting.